He thought he knew his wife better than he knew himself. 14 years of marriage, 2 children who called him daddy every single morning, a mortgage they had paid off together, and a woman who used to fall asleep with her hand resting on his chest. That was Robert's life, the only life he had ever wanted, until one Tuesday afternoon when Diane walked into the kitchen, set her car keys on the counter the way she always did, looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and said 5 words that ended everything he believed about the woman he married. "I don't love you anymore." No raised voice. No tears. Just a calm, almost rehearsed sentence from a woman who, 3 weeks earlier, had kissed him goodbye at the airport and told him she would call when she landed. She never mentioned the man. She never mentioned the hotel room, or the conversation that lasted until 4 in the morning, or the version of herself she discovered in a city 600 miles from home. By the time Robert learned the truth, it wasn't a secret anymore. It was a verdict. Before we go any further into how a woman who had built an entire life on loyalty ended up walking away from 14 years in a matter of weeks, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Diane Whitfield was 42 years old when her marriage quietly began to die, though she would not have used that word at the time. She would have said she was tired. She would have said she was busy. She would have said 100 small, reasonable things that women say when they're trying to convince themselves that nothing is actually wrong. From the outside, her life looked finished in the best sense of the word. She had Robert, a steady, hard-working man who never raised his voice, never missed a mortgage payment, and never once gave her a real reason to doubt him. She had 2 children, a daughter in middle school and a son just starting to drive, both of them proud and a little embarrassed of their parents in the way teenagers usually are. She had a house in a quiet Ohio suburb with a porch swing Robert had built the summer they moved in, and a closet full of family photographs that, if you looked at them quickly, told the story of a woman who had everything she was supposed to want. What those photographs did not show was the particular kind of loneliness that settles into a long marriage when 2 people stop noticing each other on purpose. Robert was not cruel. He was not careless with money, or unfaithful, or unkind to their children. His failure, if it could even be called that, was smaller and far more common, the kind of failure that never makes it into a courtroom because no judge would ever recognize it as harm. He had simply stopped looking at his wife the way he used to. Conversations at dinner had narrowed down to schedules and bills, and which child needed to be picked up from practice. Affection had become a habit performed out of duty rather than desire. A kiss on the cheek before work, an arm around her shoulder during a movie neither of them were really watching. Diane told her sister once, in a moment of rare honesty, that she did not feel mistreated. She felt invisible. And invisibility, she would later admit, can be far more dangerous to a marriage than any single act of betrayal, because no one ever sees it coming until it has already done its damage. That spring, Diane's company sent her to a regional conference in Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of trip she had taken a dozen times before without a second thought. Robert dropped her at the airport, told her to text him when she landed, and kissed her goodbye the same way he had 1,000 times, briefly, automatically, already thinking about the kids' schedule for the weekend. Diane remembers staring out the airplane window somewhere over the Appalachian Mountains, feeling an unfamiliar lightness in her chest that she could not quite name. It was not happiness exactly. It was something closer to possibility, the strange, almost forbidden feeling of being a person again instead of a role. She did not know yet that this feeling would become the thread that unraveled everything she had spent 14 years building, one quiet decision at a time. Starting with a hotel bar, she had no real reason to walk into that first night. His name, as far as Diane ever knew, was Marcus Caldwell. He was sitting alone at the far end of the hotel bar when she walked in, dressed simply, nursing a glass of bourbon, the kind of man who did not seem to be performing for anyone in the room. Diane had ordered a glass of wine, and intended to drink it quickly and go upstairs to prepare for the next day's sessions. That was the plan, the small, sensible plan of a tired, responsible woman who had not done anything reckless in over a decade. But Marcus said something about the conference name tag clipped to her blazer, a small joke about corporate lanyards being the modern equivalent of dog collars, and Diane laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her own ears. Within 20 minutes, she had forgotten about the meeting she was supposed to prepare for. Within an hour, she had forgotten, for the first time in years, that she was anyone's wife at all. What made that conversation different from 1,000 polite exchanges Diane had with strangers over the years was the way Marcus listened. He asked about her work and actually waited for the answer instead of using the pause to talk about himself. He asked what she used to want to be before life happened to her, and when she admitted, almost embarrassed, that she once dreamed of writing, he did not laugh or change the subject the way Robert sometimes did. He simply said that it was not too late, as if the idea had never occurred to him that it could be. Diane would later try to explain to her sister what made that night feel different, and the only honest answer she ever gave was this. For 3 hours, a stranger made her feel like the most interesting woman in the room, something her own husband had stopped doing without either of them ever noticing it had happened. By midnight, the line between flattery and something far more dangerous had completely disappeared, and Diane, against every instinct that 14 years of marriage should have built into her, did not want the night to end. What happened in that hotel room over the following hours was, in Diane's own later words, both the most alive she had felt in a decade and the beginning of a guilt that would never fully leave her body again. There was no dramatic seduction, no calculated pursuit the way these stories are sometimes imagined. There was only 2 lonely adults, several glasses of wine, and a conversation that had drifted somewhere neither of them had originally intended to go. When Diane woke the next morning, sunlight cutting through hotel curtains she did not recognize. The first emotion she felt was not regret. It was something closer to clarity, a terrifying, electric awareness that she had just touched a version of herself she thought had disappeared years ago. Marcus was already dressed, sitting quietly by the window, and when their eyes met, he did not apologize, and neither did she. He simply asked for her number, and despite every warning bell ringing somewhere deep inside her, Diane gave it to him. She told herself, on the flight home 2 days later, that it had been a mistake, an isolated lapse in judgment that she would carry privately and never repeat. She rehearsed the lies she would tell Robert about the conference being exhausting, and she meant, genuinely meant, to bury the entire experience and recommit herself to her marriage with renewed effort. For nearly 3 weeks, she succeeded. She cooked dinner every night. She initiated affection she had not bothered with in years. She even suggested a weekend getaway with Robert to reconnect, a suggestion he agreed to with quiet, grateful surprise. But underneath that effort was a current she could not fully control, a restlessness that had been dormant for so long it had felt like personality rather than suppression. Then, on a Thursday evening while Robert was at his son's basketball practice, her phone lit up with a single text message from an unknown number. 6 words that would quietly begin pulling the floor out from under everything she had spent 3 weeks trying to rebuild. I haven't stopped thinking about you. What Diane did not yet understand, what she could not have understood in that moment, was that the man who sent that message was not simply a charming stranger who had crossed her path by accident. The conversations that followed over the next several weeks felt, to Diane, like falling in love for the first time, except faster, more intense, almost frighteningly complete in a way her real marriage had never been, even at its beginning. Marcus called late at night when he knew Robert would already be asleep. He sent messages during the day that made her smile at her desk, the kind of small, electric joy she had genuinely forgotten was possible to feel for another adult. He spoke of meeting again, of a future neither of them dared name out loud yet, and slowly, deliberately, Diane began rearranging the architecture of her own life around a man she had known, in total, for one single night. By the time she finally told Robert she wanted a separation, she had already convinced herself this was not recklessness. She believed, with the kind of certainty only deep emotional intoxication can produce, that she had finally found the truth about who she was supposed to be. She had no idea yet how completely wrong she was, or how devastating the real truth about Marcus Caldwell would turn out to be. The weeks that followed Diane's first text from Marcus moved with a strange, dual rhythm that she would later struggle to explain to anyone who asked her how it all happened so fast. On the surface, her life with Robert continued almost exactly as it always had. She packed lunches, attended her daughter's soccer games, sat across from her husband at dinner, and asked about his day. But underneath that familiar routine, an entirely separate life was forming, one built on stolen phone calls, messages deleted the moment they were read, and a private excitement she had not felt in years. Diane began describing it later as living behind a curtain, one side showing the wife and mother everyone expected to see, the other hiding a woman falling deeper into something she barely understood herself. The two versions of her life could not coexist forever, and somewhere inside her, she already knew it. Marcus made it easy to believe their connection was rare, almost fated. He spoke about timing, about how strange it was that two people could meet at exactly the moment they were both ready to be truly known by someone else. He told her she deserved a life that matched the size of her feelings, not one shrunk down to fit someone else's comfort. Diane, starved for years of exactly that kind of language, absorbed every word like water after a drought. She did not notice, not yet, how often his stories about his own life shifted slightly each time he told them, a job title that changed, a hometown that moved a few states over depending on the conversation. She brushed these inconsistencies aside the way people often do when they desperately want something to be true. Diane was not foolish. She was simply a woman who had been quiet for so long that being noticed felt indistinguishable from being loved. By early summer, the secrecy had become unbearable in a different way than Diane expected. It was not guilt over Robert that wore her down first. It was the exhaustion of constantly managing two separate emotional lives, smiling through family dinners while mentally composing a message to Marcus, lying awake reviewing conversations that did not officially exist. Her sister, Karen, was the first person to notice something had shifted. Diane had always called Karen 2 or 3 times a week, but those calls had grown shorter, vaguer, filled with sentences that trailed off before finishing. When Karen finally asked her directly if everything was all right, Diane broke down on the phone, not confessing everything, but admitting enough. She said she felt like she was disappearing inside her own marriage, and that for the first time in years, she finally felt like herself again. Karen, frightened by how unfamiliar her sister sounded, gently asked one question Diane could not yet answer honestly. "Diane, who is he?" The conversation with Robert that ended their 14-year marriage did not happen the way Diane had imagined it during her sleepless nights of rehearsal. There was no confession of an affair, no dramatic admission of Marcus's name. Diane told Robert only that she had not been happy for a long time, that something inside her had gone quiet years before he ever noticed, and that she needed to leave to figure out who she still was. Robert, a man who had spent 14 years believing steadiness was the same thing as love, sat in stunned silence at their kitchen table, asking questions Diane refused to fully answer. He did not yell. He did not beg. He simply asked her, in a voice flattened by disbelief, whether there was someone else, and Diane, unable to meet his eyes, said only that it was complicated. Robert later told Karen it was the silence afterward, not the words themselves, that told him everything he needed to know. Diane moved out within 3 weeks, into a small apartment across town that Marcus had helped her find, though he was careful to keep his own name off any paperwork connected to it. She told her children the truth in the gentlest version she could manage, that their parents loved them completely, but could no longer make each other happy. A sentence that felt painfully inadequate the moment she said it out loud. Her daughter cried. Her son stopped speaking to her for almost 2 weeks. Diane told herself this pain was temporary, the unavoidable cost of finally choosing honesty over comfort. What she did not yet understand was that the honesty she believed she was choosing was built almost entirely on a man she had spent a grand total of 1 night with in person and a series of phone calls and messages in the months since, a foundation far thinner than the 14 years she had just walked away from. It was nearly 2 months after Diane moved into her new apartment, with Marcus finally promising to visit in person for the first time since that night in Charlotte, that the small inconsistencies she had been quietly ignoring began forming a pattern too large to dismiss. He canceled the visit twice, citing work emergencies that were never quite specific. When Diane asked simple questions, where exactly he lived, what his daily schedule looked like, who his closest friends were, the answers arrived vague, shifting slightly from one conversation to the next in ways that left her with an unsettled, hollow feeling she could not name. One night, unable to sleep, Diane did something she had avoided doing for months, partly out of trust, partly out of fear of what she might find. She opened her laptop and searched his full name, the one he had given her that very first night at the hotel bar. The search returned almost nothing at all. The absence of information unsettled Diane far more than any scandal would have. A man in his 40s, working in the industry he claimed, living in the city he claimed, should have left some digital trace, a professional profile, a tagged photo, a mention buried somewhere online. Instead, there was nearly nothing connecting Marcus Caldwell to the life he had described to her in painstaking, intimate detail over months of late-night conversation. Diane told herself there were innocent explanations, that some people simply valued privacy, that not everyone lived online the way the rest of the world did. But the explanation she wanted to believe and the explanation that made sense were beginning to pull apart in a way she could feel in her chest before her mind was ready to admit it. That night, for the first time since Charlotte, Diane allowed herself to ask the question she had been avoiding for months. What if the man she had given up 14 years for was not who he said he was at all? Diane spent the following week in a quiet, private panic that she could not share with anyone, not Karen, not the new friend she had made since leaving Robert, not even herself in any honest way until late at night. She began going back through every conversation she and Marcus had ever had, searching for details she could verify, a workplace, a previous address, a single relative he had ever mentioned by name. What she found instead were patterns of avoidance she had somehow excused as charm. He always steered conversations toward her childhood, her marriage, her dreams, while offering almost nothing concrete about his own life in return. Diane had mistaken this imbalance for emotional intimacy, when in reality it had left her holding an entire relationship built on her own openness and his careful, practiced silence. The realization arrived slowly, then all at once, the way water finally breaks through a crack that has been widening for months without anyone noticing. 3 days later, Marcus finally agreed to visit, arriving at Diane's apartment with flowers and an explanation for his absence that sounded rehearsed in a way she had never noticed before. Diane, calmer than she expected herself to be, asked him directly for his employer's name so she could simply look him up, something she should have done from the very beginning. Marcus hesitated, just slightly, before naming a company Diane had never heard of, one that, when she quietly searched it later that night while he slept beside her, did not appear to exist at all. In that moment, lying in the dark next to a man she had upended her entire life for, Diane felt something cold settle into her chest, the particular, sickening clarity of realizing you have built your most important decision on a foundation that may never have existed in the first place. The following morning, while Marcus showered, Diane did something she would later describe as the hardest and most necessary thing she had ever done. She opened his phone, left unlocked on the nightstand, not out of jealousy, but out of a desperate need for the truth she had been denied for months. What she found inside was not evidence of a single secret, but an entire architecture of them, messages to other women, some recent, some stretching back years, each conversation eerily similar in tone to the ones he had shared with her, the same careful listening, the same promises of being truly seen, the same vague, shifting details about his life that she now recognized as a pattern rather than coincidence. Diane sat frozen on the edge of the bed, scrolling through proof that the man she had abandoned 14 years of marriage for was not a soulmate, who had simply found her at the wrong time. He was someone who had found dozens of women exactly like her, women quietly starving for attention inside marriages that had gone silent, and had learned precisely which words would make them feel chosen. When Marcus stepped out of the bathroom and saw Diane's face, he did not deny what she had found. He did not even seem particularly surprised that she had discovered it, as though some distant part of him had always expected this moment to arrive eventually. He spoke instead with a strange, detached honesty, explaining that he had never set out to deceive anyone in the way she imagined, that he simply could not seem to stop seeking out women who made him feel, for a brief window of time, like a better version of himself before the feeling inevitably faded and he moved on to find it again somewhere else. He told Diane, almost gently, that everything he had said to her in those late-night conversations had felt true in the moment he said it, which was, in its own devastating way, far worse than if he had simply been lying outright. Diane realized then that Marcus was not a calculated predator hunting for money or status. He was something harder to name, a man chasing the feeling of being wanted with no real intention, or perhaps even ability, of staying once he found it. The days that followed were among the loneliest Diane had ever experienced. She packed Marcus's few belongings from her apartment, changed her locks, and sat alone that first night in the silence of a home she had built around a man who had never actually existed in the way she believed. She thought, with a kind of grief she had not expected, about Robert, about 14 years of small, steady mornings she had once mistaken for boredom, and wondered for the first time whether the emptiness she had felt in her marriage had truly come from Robert's distance, or from something unresolved inside herself that no amount of attention from any man, familiar or new, could have ever fully filled. She called Karen that night and finally told her everything. The hotel bar, the messages, the apartment, the phone full of other women's names. Karen listened without judgment, and at the end of the call said only one quiet sentence that Diane would carry with her for a long time afterward. You didn't lose Robert because of Marcus. You lost yourself long before either of them. Diane reached out to Robert nearly a month later, uncertain what she even hoped to hear when he answered. She did not ask for forgiveness, and she did not pretend the past several months had not happened. She simply told him the truth, all of it, without softening the details the way she had during their final conversation at the kitchen table. Robert listened in silence for a long time before speaking, and when he finally did, his voice carried none of the anger Diane had braced herself for, only a tired, quiet sadness that felt somehow heavier than rage would have. He told her he appreciated her honesty, but that 14 years of trust did not simply reset, because the man she left him for had turned out to be a liar. He was not interested in being a consolation prize for a mistake she had made elsewhere. The conversation ended there, gently but completely, and Diane understood, perhaps for the first time with total clarity, that some doors do not stay open no matter how sincerely you knock on them afterward. In the months that followed, Diane slowly rebuilt a life that looked nothing like the one she had imagined for herself at any point in the last 15 years. She kept her small apartment, returned to writing for the first time since college, the dream Marcus had once flattered her about, but never actually encouraged her to pursue in any meaningful way. Robert eventually moved on as well, civil and cooperative for the sake of their children, though the easy warmth between them never returned. Their daughter and son adjusted slowly, the way children of divorce often do, carrying quiet wounds that would surface in different ways for years to come. Diane never spoke to Marcus again after that final morning in her apartment, though she later learned through a mutual acquaintance that he had resurfaced in another city, with another woman, telling, presumably, some version of the same story that had once felt so singular and true to her. Looking back, Diane has said she does not believe she was simply a victim of one manipulative man, though Marcus's deception was real and deliberate in ways she did not fully understand until it was far too late. She believes now that her marriage to Robert did not end the night she met a stranger in a hotel bar in Charlotte. It ended slowly, quietly, over years of two people forgetting how to truly see each other, until the smallest flicker of attention from someone new felt large enough to mistake for love. The truth that destroyed her was never really about who Marcus turned out to be. It was the harder, more uncomfortable truth about herself, that she had been willing to dismantle 14 years of a real, if imperfect, life in pursuit of a feeling that had never been built on anything solid at all. Diane's story is not unique, and that may be the most unsettling part of all. Marriages do not usually end in a single dramatic moment. They end in years of small silences, unanswered questions, and quiet invisibility that two people allow to grow between them without ever naming it out loud. Somewhere tonight, another version of Diane is sitting across the table from a husband who has stopped truly looking at her, wondering if the spark she feels for a stranger means she has finally found herself, or simply found a more convincing way to lose herself completely. Before you go, we want to hear from you honestly. If you were in Robert's position, do you think you could have ever forgiven Diane? And if you were Diane, do you believe you would have recognized the warning signs before it was too late? Or do you think any of us are capable of making the exact same mistake under the right circumstances? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this story moved you the way it moved us to tell it, make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss the next story.